1975 saw the debut of Milos Forman's One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest and Ousmane Sembène's Xala, both dealing with medical conditions and social criticisms. One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest swept the Academy Awards that year, winning Best Picture, Best Director, Best Screenplay, Best Actor, and Best Actress. However, before we talk about McMurphy, let's go to the other side of the world. Sembène hailed from Senegal and was a very prolific author, writing numerous stories about his native country and the after effects of colonialism. Xala is the adaptation of Sembène's novel of the same title, dealing with the incompetence and impotence and corruption of neocolonial bourgeoisie. In the beginning of the film, we see huge crowds gathered outside cheering the removal of the European colonists. And here we see leading men removing the statues and other materials of the colony. But as the scene continues, the men change their shape. Their clothing changes from traditional garb to the suits of the Europeans, and they're loaded with briefcases full of money. The story in Xala is an allegorical story involving satire surrounding the man in this picture, El Hadji, as he prepares to take a third wife. Here we see El Hadji with his first two wives, one traditional, his second wife more modern, as part of the critique that Sembène has against the neocolonial bourgeoisie. The wedding goes off without a hitch and everything seems fine. Here, El Hadji is preparing to have relations with his new bride, but his new mother-in-law has some advice for him, which he does not take. El Hadji has moved beyond the superstitions of traditional life, and he's embraced this more modern take, and he puts any of those superstitions and rituals, he pushes them aside. They're ridiculous. He doesn't need them. But lo and behold, when it comes time for action, he finds himself impotent. He can't consummate the marriage. Lo and behold, all those things he was too good for, he is now seeking out. He seeks out a shaman, a marabout, anything to cure his impotence. He has to consummate this marriage. He wants to be with his new bride, and he will do anything to do it, even humiliating himself. What we will learn later, after things have fallen apart for El Hadji, is that these men have put the Xala on him. They have cursed him for actions done in the past, and they are offering him a way to remove it. Earlier in the film, Sembène showed these deplorables outside El Hadji's business, and he had them evicted to the desert. And here we see them coming back into the city, and you can see the influence of neorealism on Sembène's shots. These are not actors. Sembène uses these deplorables or undesirables as to represent the majority of the country, the people who are being taken advantage of by the new bourgeoisie, this neo-capitalist society. And in the next instance, you're going to see how property is valued over people.
Sont indésirables dans ce secteur, mais nous respectons la propriété privée.
In this scene, Sembène has one of the guards of El Hadji, one of the troops, is washing his car with imported bottled water. And it just represents sort of the excessive tastes of the new bourgeoisie, the exploitive usage of items and their reliance on the foreign powers to supply them with these imported goods. This shot is of the wedding cake from El Hadji's wedding, and you can see that the cake topper is Anglo woman and Anglo man, definitely not representative of the people in El Hadji's culture. And Sembène is using this to show the shallowness of the new bourgeois. Here's the climax of the film as the deplorable spit on El Hadji. They cover his body in the fluids in order for him to regain his manhood. And so the bourgeoisie have to be humiliated and brought low so that the people can be exalted, so that they can be recognized and their retribution given to them. And now we transition into One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, where this idea of deplorables and recognition and being taken advantage of is also found, but in a slightly different context, as this deals with the mental illness and more of an individual versus society, or individual versus the machinery, the system, whereas Sembene focused more on the oppression of the proletariat in his movies. So the film is itself an adaptation of the novel of the same name by Ken Kesey, and he wrote it and included lots of personal experience from when he was in a psych ward, tripping out on LSD, and seeing how people were treated in that facility, and his own opinions on how that should work. And so the screenplay adapts that, and Kesey was originally involved, but then dropped out over various issues. The film itself deals with McMurphy's attempt to get out of a labor camp and get into a mental hospital to serve out the remainder, what he thinks is the remainder of his prison sentence. So he puts on a little bit of an act here to try to convince people that he's crazy. But we're going to see that this actually ends up being a bad idea for him. A beautiful shot here of the door framed, and the door in the background framed as well, as McMurphy's led into the psych ward. And again, he's kind of putting on his act of insanity, though no one really believes it. None of the people in power actually believe it. And so it's interesting how they treat him and the things they do to him, even though they know or believe that he's not actually crazy. McMurphy befriends this group of men and helps to break them out of their shells. And throughout these therapy sessions where they're seated here, they're actually very personal items are brought out in front of the group, and they're torn apart. And the nurses are helping to tear them apart, which actually facilitates them staying there longer instead of actually being healed and going back. And Jack learns some pretty surprising stuff. Sorry, I meant McMurphy. Here's McMurphy with Chief, and McMurphy works on Chief. Chief doesn't speak. He supposedly can't hear either, though this is a facade as well. They pretend, just like McMurphy's pretending to be crazy. But he gets into all sorts of hijinks to make these men feel alive, to bring out life in them, and to kind of put a middle finger up to the system. In addition to stealing the bus, McMurphy steals a boat with all the men, and they pretend they're all doctors on a fishing expedition, and they continue to do all kinds of various hijinks. He brings aboard Candy, a prostitute that he knows, and proceeds to try to have intercourse with her on the boat, and it just sounds like madness. Unlike Xala, Cuckoo's Nest has a direct antagonist, Dr. Ratchet, and she is the person that McMurphy is trying to put his thumb at and always disrupt and carry on with. But as you can see in this next clip, he starts to realize that things aren't as cracked up as they're supposed to be, and there's a bit of a tension and a threat here in this film, and I want you to watch the whole exchange here.
I'll be seeing you on the outside, you know what I mean?
By the time you get out of here, you're too old to even get it up.
68 days, buddy. 68 days.
What the fuck you talking about, 68 days? That's in jail, sucker. I still don't know where you at.
Yeah, where am I at, Washington?
With us, baby. You're with us. And you're gonna stay with us until we let you go.
The earlier exchange with Washington and other instances of violence between McMurphy and Washington eventually lead to him suffering electroshock therapy. And this scene is very shocking and is one of the scenes that helped end that practice throughout the country, and is what a lot of people refer to when they think of electroshock therapy.
Okay, this won't hurt, and it'll be over in just a moment.
Uh-huh. What's that?
Conductant.
A little dab will do you. Right, Mr. Jackson?
Open your mouth.
What's that?
This will keep you from biting your tongue.
Well,
Now just bite down on it.
oh,
That's right. Just bite down.
huh?
Now bite down on it.
Good.
McMurphy's obviously in a lot of pain, but his antics continue and they actually increase. Though he develops this relationship with Chief, they're going to make an escape, but when the time comes for it, things don't quite work out the way they should.
Me to do, you know what I mean? Is that it? Is that crazy enough for you?
On the night of his escape, McMurphy brings in Candy and another prostitute to show the boys a good time. Things seem to be going great until the orderlies show up and disrupt everything. And as McMurphy's trying to make his escape, Billy commits suicide. And so McMurphy attacks Nurse Ratched. Here's a still image of that attack as he's finally taking the violence straight to the authority of the system. But McMurphy, this ultimately proves to be his undoing, because then he is caught and he is taken away from everyone else, and no one really knows what happens. This is the end of the movie. Chief comes over to talk to Mac and make their escape, like they had talked about, getting out of there and going to Canada, but something doesn't seem right. Chief realizes something's wrong. Roger Ebert wrote that a lot of people think of One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest as McMurphy's success, but it's really more about his failure, because he doesn't make it. His plan fails. Yet that failure helps to awaken Chief to his freedom.
Gone without you, man. I wouldn't leave you here this way. You're coming with me.
Sembeni's Xala and Foreman's One Flew Over the Cuckoo Nest both share a lot of similarities. There's a medical issue that's kind of at the center of the story. There's a robust main character carrying the story forward, but they also diverge in a lot of important parts, where Sembene sees it more as a movie for advocating for the masses, One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest is more about the individual against the system. Sembene's film is more of a satire, and Foreman's film has a lot of play involved, a lot of surreal elements like stealing the bus and going on a fishing trip and not really facing any consequences for that. The two movies also try to emphasize the abuse of authority and corruption and power. Sembene's film offers a better characterization of women. There's more nuance to the role of women and to their power and authority in their relationships. One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, it's a little bit more of a domineering woman, and then the other women are prostitutes and used for sex, and a good time. So there's this juxtaposition here between the way women are portrayed in these two films as well. It's pretty interesting. Is deserving of its clean sweep of the awards. The impact of the film in terms of medical situation in the United States, mental health, seeing patients as individuals and not as a problem to society, those concepts personified in the characters, brought forth in the characters, really is what elevated that movie to greatness.